Hi, everybody. This is Rob Doggett coming at you with another installment of our Yates Conversations. I'm here on behalf of the International Yates Society and State University of New York at Geneseo. And I'm going to welcome Peter McDonald to talk about Yates's September 1913. Peter's a was a professor of British and Irish poetry at the University of Oxford from 1999 to 2023. He's now an emeritus student at Christ Church, Oxford. People know his work. He's author of many works of criticism. His books include Louis MacNeice, The Poet in His Context, Mistaken Identities, Poetry in Northern Ireland, Serious Poetry, Form and Authority from Yeats to Hill, and Sound Intentions, The Working of Rhyme in 19th Century Poetry. Peter's also a highly accomplished poet. His collected poems published in 2012. His latest volume, One Little Room, was published in 2024. And I just yesterday ordered One Little Room after looking at some of the samples. So that's going to be arriving on Sunday. And Yates people are going to know that he's the editor of the Longman Annotated English Poets edition of W.B. Yeats. So it's good to see you, Peter. Welcome.
Hi, nice to
Uh,
be here.
it's great to have you. And so you're working on the Longman. I imagine that's your main project right now.
Yeah, I think, Rob, basically between now and death, it's a good chance that I'll be working on the Longman Yates whenever anybody asks me what I'm up to. But yes, I am. We're currently we're currently about two-thirds of the way, well, half of the
Wow.
way through volume four,
Okay, okay, volume four.
which
Okay,
um,
okay.
which, which I'm hoping to get into the publishers in 2027, which covers the years 1911 to probably 1917. That
Okay.
is, I'm headed for Yeats's marriage,
Yeah.
really.
Okay.
Um, but with a project like this, it's impossible really to give these firm date parameters for volumes because suddenly something comes and becomes much bigger than you thought it would.
Hmm.
So I'm guiltily aware that there are some big poems that might generate a book's worth of annotation. However, I'm going to be rather stricter as we get into Yeats's more mature career. I'm going to become a little stricter with myself in what I
Hmm.
say and don't say, or rather, what I let other people say and not say, because
Well,
with the young Yeats, there's actually pretty much a dearth of critical material. So I felt I had to explore that for other people's benefit. But as we get to the better known poems, of course, it's a bit like trying to annotate what critics have said about Shakespeare. If you tried to do everything, you'd go crazy.
mhm.
So the emphasis is shifting a little as we get into the 19 teens onto what you might call more original research about the contexts of the poems and things like that. Anyway, volume
They're
four.
they're indispensable for people doing work on Yates. I love them. I've used them a lot, and I'm really looking forward to the new ones. And it kind of, you're saying moving into the mature phase, cues up nicely September 1913. And I have to say, it is a poem that I sometimes like and sometimes dislike. I mean, I think it depends if I'm feeling nostalgic for my sort of college days of shaking my fist at capitalism and the bourgeoisie, that sort of stuff. And I like it. And then
Who could
sometimes,
tire of that, Rob? Who could tire of
well,
that?
sometimes, I'm a middle-aged guy on the golf course. I'm pretty firmly in the bourgeoisie at this point. So I sort of am like, oh, come on, Yeats, give it a rest. But the other thing about that poem is I don't often teach it in classes where I'm just doing a couple of days or maybe a week or two on Yeats. It's a poem I tend to teach when I'm focused solely on Yeats because it for me it's, and I imagine other people feel this way. It's really important as a kind of marker of that change that has occurred, um, from The Wind Among the Reeds through that sort of transitional period into 1914 with responsibilities. We're sort of saying, well, now we're getting the mature Yeats and the real stylistic differences. I don't teach it on its own, when I'm doing these shorter bits on Yeats though, because it's I find you got to get into the weeds pretty quickly about, what's going on with my students. Well, who the heck is John O'Leary? What's, what's he so angry about? And then you're off into the art gallery and th things that we're gonna talk about today. So, but let me ask you this: Why did you could have picked lots of choices? Why did you choose this poem?
Well, in fact, it's related to what you're saying, Rob. That is to say, I'm fascinated with this as a poem of individual artistic transition, change. Having said that, it's very hard to find a poem by Yeats that is not transitional.
Yeah,
I've decided,
yeah,
everything is in the process of imagining what could come next and could come next differently. But so with that sort of caveat, I'd still say that this is a very significant transitional poem in the sense that it's moving into a voice that when you sit down and you look at this from a back, sit back and look at this couldn't conceivably be the voice of the person who in 1899 has published The Wind Among the Reeds.
hmm hmm
Uh, it's it, if that poet is present anywhere, he's only present to be derided
hmm
in this
hmm
kind of writing.
hmm
Uh, not this is not to say that it's a clear indicator of what Yeats is going to do in the next 3 4 years. It's not quite that either. In strange ways, it's almost foreshadowing much later Yeats.
hmm
Indeed, weirdly, the Yeats of the 1930s seems to be
Yeah.
somewhere
Yeah.
implicit.
Yeah.
You know, now this might be a formal thing. This might be something to do with um, ballads and it's actually the wonderful Yeats critic and biographer Terence Brown said about this poem that he called it the most lethal of the broadsides in which appeared a group of 5 poems which appeared always together at first in poems written in discouragement, like the
hmm
pamphlet,
hmm
then in responsibilities. So it's the most lethal of these broadsides. It's couched as it is in the rhythms of traditional balladry, in which national heroes have been apotheosized since the 18th century, and employing a heady refrain and a mesmeric imagery of heroic sacrifice set against the grotesque of a lampoon.
hmm
So, I mean, Terry's heroic and lampoon seem to be very interesting terms here. And actually, they're going to remain in play in quite different poems as Yeats goes further. But he's already in this poem learning how you can lampoon the heroic
hmm
and make lampooning heroic in itself.
hmm
Um, but the other transitional, well, I say transitional, the moment of decision, it's a sort of artistic moment of decision for Yeats, which is also a political moment of decision.
hmm
He's going to say the unacceptable thing very clearly, more clearly, I think, than he said it before. He'd had a sort of attempt to say something, and it was about the always ongoing Hugh Lane Gallery dispute just a few months earlier in January of 1913, when he published a poem to a wealthy man,
hmm
which you could say is also a kind of a political burning of bridges, but it of course assumes a high style. I don't
hmm
want to spend time on that, but it is Yeats mounting the high horse of Renaissance
Yeah,
allusion.
all the references to the Renaissance
Yeah,
in that, and it's
yeah,
a different kind of poem, same
yeah.
general subject, but a
Same
different bridge.
subject. Now this is kind of turning inside out.
hmm
And it's going to say something unacceptable to Ireland, but it's going to say it now not in an Italianate, but in an Irish way,
hmm
or what Yeats chose to take anyway as an Irish idiom.
Okay,
Uh,
okay. That makes
this is
that makes a lot of sense.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go into some of the slides because you sent me some of the slides and I'd like you to read the poem, but this is already a good we're already getting off, I think, on a good foot with this, and I'm learning new things actually already. So if you don't mind reading it for us, please.
Well, I tell you, what you've brought up there, Rob, is the final text, if you like, of the poem. Doesn't change much, by the way, over its life. but its title changes a
Hmm.
good deal. So that is what we know as September 1913. Uh, no comma, but I'm not going to get into this relationship between this and Easter 1916 at the moment. But if, Rob, you wouldn't mind going to the
Yes,
next
the next one
slide,
you have, I think the Romance in Ireland.
this,
Yes.
this is what you would have seen had you opened the Irish Times on the day. Um, and you'll notice here we have a different title from what we're used to, Romance in Ireland, uh, with a subtitle on reading much of the correspondence against the art gallery. I love the much, by the way. It does suggest that after a certain point you'd give up. Um, I, I say that slightly sadly because I rather suspect I've read more of the correspondence than Yeats could ever be bothered to do, and I think Yeats was quite right. But it has its pleasures. Um, anyway, I'll read the poem as it appears there, um, and my apologies in advance if I come over a bit more rhetorical, a bit more rhetorically than I usually
Like
would do.
it's okay. It's just a podcast. Get.
But I shall blame the spirit of WBY. There is, by the way, a little snippet. I should have dug this out, but time beat me. Uh, I think it's only the first stanza, but there's a tiny bit of recording of Yeats reading
Oh,
this, which I'm
really?
sure I've come across. So others will
Oh my
find
God, I'd love to hear that. I did not know that. Okay.
it's a tiny bit. But it's if you think I sound angry when I read it, it's not. I've got nothing on Yeats. This is the 1930s, and he's giving it everything. So, but here it is in its 1913 form for the reader of the Irish Times. Romance in Ireland on reading much of the correspondence against the art gallery. What need you, being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till, and add the halfpence to the pence, and prayer to shivering prayer, until you've dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save. Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet they were of a different kind, the names that stilled your childish play. They've gone about the world like wind, but little time had they to pray, for whom the hangman's rope was spun. And what, God help us, could they save? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing upon every tide? For this that all that blood was shed? For this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet, and Wolfe Tone, all that delirium of the brave? Romantic Ireland's dead and gone, it's with O'Leary in the grave. Yet could we turn the years again and call those exiles as they were, in all their loneliness and pain, you'd cry, some woman's yellow hair has maddened every mother's son. They weighed so lightly what they gave. But let them be, they're dead and gone. They're with O'Leary in the grave.
I love it. Well done. That's the best of all the people reading. That's my new favorite on these
It's kind of
podcasts.
frightening. I feel that the bad spirits are sort of coming through here, you know?
I was thinking about it's funny because I never met my grandfather who was Irish. He died when my dad was young, but my dad would do impressions of him and what God help us could they say that was a favorite. God help us was a favorite one he would do. So I was
It
thinking
is. It
the
is.
ghosts of my grandfather there. That's
No, no, the interjection in any statement of God help us is to uh, is to express an absolute irritation, I suppose, um, at a failure to get through.
Mhm.
It has a variant. I say all this for the remote future who will not realize what they spoke in Ireland, you know. But
Mhm.
its variant is God Save Us.
Oh yeah.
So I think God Save Us is one step up from God Help Us. A footnote to a footnote.
I love the anger of this, and one of the things that strikes my students is sort of like, as we're reading this, and I do try to emphasize the kind of bitterness and anger in it. And one of their first questions is, what, God help us, is he so angry about having to do with an art gallery? And
Yeah,
so maybe if you could talk just a little bit about the Hugh Lane
yeah.
context for people who are not entirely familiar with it.
Well, no, I'm dependent on you at this point, Rob, to stop me when it becomes too crazy um, uh, and too long. But and indeed, it isn't the easiest thing to credit now that there should be such an intense and such, in fact, a long-running political row in Ireland about an art gallery appearing or not appearing in Dublin. Um, I would, if anyone's looking for a very, very good, crisp, and actually very entertaining, slightly skeptical introduction to this, I really would recommend the chapter in Lucy
Lucy,
McDermott's
yeah,
book
yeah.
about Irish controversies, which catches a number of the salient points. But if I can just very, very quickly run through what's at issue here. Sir Hugh Lane wasn't ever clear why he got the Sir when he did. That's never been explained. But he was a nephew, a, an impoverished nephew of the not unimpoverished Lady Gregory. Um, and as kind of a protege as well as a nephew of hers. Um, but he basically no university education for Lane, but he was sent out to earn a crust, really, which he did in the rather strange and still imperfectly understood world of art dealers in in turn of the century London and England. Um, a really instructive book about this is actually Augusta Gregory's biography
Mhm.
of Hugh Lane after he died, because Lane was to die in the Lusitania.
Yeah.
Um, uh, though even after he was dead, by the way, controversy didn't go away, and we find Yeats and others getting in touch with him posthumously for his views on legal matters. However, he became very rich very, very quickly. Now, I simply say that, and it sounds as though I'm opening a can of worms, which I've no intention of exploring. Well, I don't have the time to explore it, but I've had to do quite a lot of work on Lane. And the mystery of his sudden wealth has never properly been explained. Um, we do know that he had a great friend who could apparently create a Franz Hals within a couple of days, such as to persuade an auction room, and that they never really lost touch. Anyway, be that having thrown that one out there, I'll just leave it. But he becomes very wealthy, very well known art dealer. If, for example, and I'm sure many people watching this will do this, you go to places like the Frick Collection in New York, you will see there some of the very finest paintings acquired from Hugh Lane. And they're not fakes, okay? Lest anyone think that they are. However, he had a sudden, having been a Renaissance specialist, as it were, and dealer, he had a sudden conversion to French Impressionism, um, which featured the works of some people who have been more forged than anyone else, okay, making art history. But he started to run a very interesting project, which was very, very nationalistic for Ireland. Um, you know, by the way, what Hugh Lane was doing, being nationalistic about Ireland, nobody again has ever explained. I think it was a way to sell pictures. Anyway, he had a great, and it was in fact a great French Impressionist collection, which he offered to give to the nation. I am, of course, being
I know.
slightly
I
skeptical,
know. Yeah.
but I'm being no more skeptical than many of the people in Dublin politics at the time, because they were being presented with this extraordinary cultural offer, which was, look, here are these paintings. I will lend them to you until you buy them. And when you buy them, there's going to be a great collection for the cultural life of the future, because this is modern, late 19th century, mid 19th century French painting.
Mhm.
This is going to help educate a whole generation of
Mhm.
Irish artists,
Mhm.
cultural battery. Um, this was bought into very heavily by Yeats. And I say bought into, I mean notionally. Of course, he didn't part with a penny, didn't have a penny to part with. But Lane's idea seems to have made a lot of people quite suspicious. No, they were the suspicious type, many of them in Dublin, careful about money. All this, by the way, is going to be relevant to our poem. Very careful about money. Didn't like to see it wasted.
Mhm.
And the project got more and more grandiose. And Lucy's book deals with this extremely
Bridge
well.
bridge gallery, talk of a bridge gallery, that sort of thing, yeah, over the Liffey.
The, the vista, the vista in Dublin that we would both know very, very well, the Halfpenny Bridge and across the Liffey there, was almost going to be a massive Palladian across the river art gallery designed by Edward Lutyens. Um, if only the people of Dublin would pay for it. Now, Yeats, of course, thought that a kind of natural aristocracy in Dublin society, also known as the Guinness family,
Mhm.
would uh, would shell out. He was a little frustrated that they didn't, um, but others did, and Dublin Council, the corporation, actually gave £20,000, quite a lot of money, towards this, but was still in 1913 stalled on the question of where the gallery would be and who would design it.
Mhm.
It had evolved from being a gallery on St. Stephen's Green, at the edge of St. Stephen's Green, to be designed by an Irish architect. That went out the window when the relevant Guinness said it would spoil the view.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
but but now there's this across the Liffey monstrosity, um, which, by the way, just think if it had all happened. Some of the finest French Impressionist paintings would have been straddling the Liffey just at the time when everything on that river side was being blown up
Oh
in
God, yeah.
the
I hadn't
disaster.
even. I was thinking more about the Liffey was not the cleanest of river. I was thinking, God, the damage to the paintings, but I hadn't even thought about that. Of course, yeah.
Yeah, I
Not
mean,
long afterward, there was shelling of the forecourts right
it
there.
would have
So,
suffered. It would have suffered the fate of the customs house.
oh God, yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so a good thing that it never worked. However, it left, as far as Yeats was concerned, here was this wonderful Renaissance man, Sir Hugh Lane, who, out of the goodness of his heart and the generosity of his spirit, was offering Ireland a culture. Ireland didn't have a culture, so it needed this, and it was French. It's not irrelevant to the poem, by the way, that France is involved
Hmm.
as the place from which to learn, because France, as we know, had a long prehistory of being Ireland's recourse.
Hmm.
And that again is going to come into this
Yes,
poem.
I could think about how that's going to happen. So that's some context. He's upset, of course, and talking with my students, I'll often show them this version, or I have some slides with the actual, in the newspaper with the articles around it and the editorials, and my students are like, oh God, they're they're debating things in the newspaper using poetry. And that's completely foreign to them. And I said, well, back then people liked poetry, but a little bit cared a little bit more about poetry. Um, the second question though, after I go through that, then the next question is who's O'Leary?
Mm,
And that answering that question is complicated again because you're sort of like, well, which O'Leary are we thinking about? I mean, we're thinking about O'Leary from the 50s, 60s, the kind of Fenian guy, or are we thinking about the O'Leary who was more, more recent? I mean, he lived until a couple, I think, what, 5 or 6 years before the poem was published. So, it's sort of a distant O'Leary from the past, but then there's an O'Leary in the present. So, I
yeah.
think one of your next slides might have. Oh, there's so okay. So this is one of the articles about the art gallery,
Yes. Yes.
and
Yes.
then and then here we go. Here's O'Leary.
Yes. That's by John Butler Yeats, the father of the poet, who made that in 1904. I mean, you can see the Old Testament prophet with a hat on his knee. Um, but yeah, he was actually he died in 1907.
1907. Okay.
Okay, um, so that gives us about 6 years before the poem.
Okay.
Um, but a lot of what I have to say about the poem actually takes us back to 1907
Okay.
and the difficulties that Yeats faced in any kind of farewell to John O'Leary. That a good question which I can't quite answer is there a Yeats poem that's an elegy for John O'Leary? The answer is no, unless it's this.
Mm-hmm.
Unless it's this.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a very odd kind of elegy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, uh, I mean, there is perhaps a genre of elegy which says, "You're dead, stay dead." Um, poor old go back a few hundred years, and poor old John Donne was on the receiving end of more than one such elegy. Um, but it's not the usual way of doing things. Um, and yet, when I mentioned earlier these five poems that come together at this time, five angry poems. Um, Another one of them is about Parnell.
Mm-hmm.
Parnell is told explicitly not to come out of the grave.
Yeah. Yeah.
Draw the glass Nevin coverlet over your head. Um, so whether people are staying in the grave or not is a sort of moot point. Yeats' poetic persona gives itself the power to bid the dead stay dead
Mm-hmm.
when necessary.
Mm-hmm.
So this poem we're talking about, of course, declaring not just O'Leary physically dead, but what O'Leary represents physically, metaphorically dead also.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Now, O'Leary was born in 1830, so his generation is the generation that became in the 1860s the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or
Right.
the Fenians, as they're known. Um, just I'll come in a moment to that next slide, but before I do, I just want to remind us all of how Yeats had been involved in the Fenians poetically and perhaps personally. Um, Biographers suspect, but as far as I know, can't prove that the young Yeats did take the Fenian oath.
Yeah.
Um, Interestingly, John O'Leary, who was senior Fenian all the way through the 1860s, was said never to have taken the oath on the very interesting grounds that he didn't need to.
Hmm.
I wonder, could we apply that to all sorts of undertakings now? Well, I approve of this oath, but I won't. Obviously, I don't need to take it. It's a very useful thing to say, really.
Uh-huh.
Um, but O'Leary had joined the Irish Republican Brotherhood. The very senior figure, a generation before O'Leary, was James Stephens. Stephens is now buried in, O'Leary is buried within feet of Stephens.
Yeah.
in Glasnevin. Um, they themselves were the inheritors of what we call Young Ireland, which is sort of an 1840s phenomenon of the combination, and this for Yeats is very important, the combination of political nationalist subversion and activism with cultural activism.
Right, right.
And you can't really disentangle these two things. You were saying, Rob, about people liked to read poetry in the political bits of the papers, but for Ireland in the 19th century, poetry became politics, certainly in the hands of Thomas Davis and Young Ireland, and then again in the 1860s, generation or two later, for people associated with O'Leary, not least his sister, Ellen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, O'Leary was really a journalist. I think if we had to say what was he was deep down, he was a journalist. That is really what he could do. So he gets to edit the IRB's newspaper, which doesn't last very long for obvious reasons. And in the midst of hugely misconceived and unsuccessful moves by the IRB in 1864-65, we find O'Leary being arrested,
Right.
various others. Well, some managed to get away, O'Leary didn't. And given a long sentence of penal servitude. I have somewhere a picture on that slideshow, which I am very suspicious of now. Yes. Now, look, having sent this to you, John O'Leary is a prisoner circa 1865. I just want to issue a slight health warning, which is, I think that is too good. That is the John O'Leary writing looks, and the prisoner number look about right. But that's a bit suspiciously good for 1865.
It sure is.
I'm wondering, is there some maniac out there who's priming AI to do?
Yeah, it's an AI generated.
So I'd love that to be right. I'd love that to be true. That portrait, because of course it shows you the young man or the young girl.
I've never seen that before.
No, nor have I.
It's always the big beard. John O'Leary is the image I
I
always.
really hope I'm not perpetrating a fraud now, which will persist for generations. But hey, I was talking about Hugh Lane a minute ago.
Who knows?
Questions of authenticity are moot. Anyway, he had curious. The question of what did John O'Leary believe is very hard to answer, because Yeats presents him in one way and others present him in quite different way. And it hinges on what you might call the physical force tradition of Irish nationalism, to which the IRB were fully signed up. Everybody remembers the things that supposedly said by O'Leary that Yeats quotes. There are things a man must not do to save a nation. Principally cry. Principally cry. Don't cry in public, even to save a nation. But if you give me even a small nation to save, I think I'm willing to cry in order to achieve that. But hey, not John O'Leary. But bear in mind that 1865, the IRB, they'd recently blown up, trying to get to spring a prisoner. They'd just casually blown up and killed 12 civilians in Clerkenwell.
Know that.
These are the word hadn't been invented, but the word terrorist is not a million miles away from what the IRB were.
Well, it's interesting too, because if you're reading Yeats's accounts, that sort of dovetail with Yeats's own sort of suspicious autobiographical narratives, where it's sort of I dabbled in this sort of physical force tradition, but I got over it pretty quickly and turned to culture, and he creates that same sort of narrative of O'Leary of yes, back then he was the Fenian, yes, he dabbled in these things, but but now he's the great he's sort of leader of culture and that the kind of model for Yeats. And I think that's, as you're talking about some of the history of O'Leary, it's interesting. I knew he'd been jailed, but I didn't know, I had never looked into what for. And that's pretty striking. And thinking about this context, and I think you're right, that question of which O'Leary which version turns on that issue of physical force nationalism.
Yeah, indeed. And of course, the cultural side of O'Leary is really after he has been released from jail and has come back from exile. He
Hmm.
was, of course, released on condition that he didn't come back to Ireland. So he spends time in here it comes, in France.
Okay. Okay.
The natural home of the Irish nationalist in exile always has been France, ever since the end of the 17th century, and the wild geese,
Wild
so
geese
which who make their way, you'll notice.
into the
Uh,
poem.
um, so in France, he's yeah, he is a bit of a draw for any nationalist who happens to be abroad. Um, so he's already writing O'Leary is writing the oral history of
Mhm.
doomed uh, 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 his own doomed enterprises. Eventually, he comes back to Ireland, and it is a moment when, in Yeats's many retrospects, it's as though some kind of chemical was released into the water, and suddenly culture started to fizz and to pop.
Yeah.
Look into this more carefully, and the culture is basically the young W.B. Yeats,
Uh-huh.
who was taken under O'Leary's wing. Why was this? I mean, is it that O'Leary was the most exceptionally perceptive poetry critic of about in the last 500 years or so? Because the young W.B. Yeats taken under O'Leary's wing was, uh, you know, not necessarily a poet who was going to turn into a great poet. Can I put it that way? But he writes to please O'Leary. O'Leary, who was a book collector, was a rabid bibliophile, as a matter of fact, uh, puts his massive library at Yeats's disposal. Yeats actually moves in with him for a while.
Mhm.
And Yeats but this is long before, this is a good while before Lady Gregory is anywhere to be seen. He is absorbing all
Mhm.
sorts of Irish antiquarianism, history, you name it. So he owes O'Leary a lot. We see the debt. Well, see, where does the debt produce artistic results for Yeats? We'll see it in Yeats's, I think, crucial mini epic, "The Wanderings of a Sheen," in the late 1880s, where I want just to think about that for a second. Here we have a story of the Fenians, and they're called the Fenians.
Mhm.
But of course, they're the mythic or
Ancient.
early
Yeah. Yeah.
historical Fianna. Um, and yet, you can't go for more than a page, really, in The Wanderings of Sheen without being aware that Fenians is a current term as well as an antiquarian term.
Mm.
But
Mm.
here in Sheen, you have a Fenian who has been away, who's been in admittedly a rather nice kind of exile.
Nice,
But
nice islands.
yeah,
Mm.
but back he comes, back to a debased world. What's debased about it? Well, it's modern.
Yeah.
Basically, Yeats couldn't write the phrase yet, but it is the filthy modern tide,
Mm.
which is washing over Machine's world, and he can't accept it,
Mm.
and it will destroy it.
Hmm. Hmm.
But it's also a religious world. Machine is a pagan who despises the Christianity into which Ireland has fallen. Um, One of the nicknames given to O'Leary by people who didn't like him much was Pagan O'Leary.
Yeah. I mean, he was very quite hostile to the
Very
church.
hostile.
Yes.
Um, and this, of course, is another uh, level, really, of mainstream nationalist thought in Ireland in the 19th century, which is anti-clericalism.
Hmm.
Yeats would have pointed you towards really important moments there, like like the fall of Parnell,
Parnell, yeah.
and the role that was played there by
Hmm.
the Catholic establishment, and indeed you'll find that in the other young poet, semi taken up by John and Ellen O'Leary in Dublin in the 1880s, and that's Catherine Tynan.
Hmm.
Who's,
I think it
uh,
was, oh yeah, there's Ellen O'Leary there.
there's Ellen. She died, as you will see, by the way, in 1889.
Hmm.
But she and John both, you know, ran a kind of literary forcing house for people like Tynan and Yeats.
Hmm.
And Catherine Tynan had, I shall just quote it.
I couldn't remember if you had something from Tynan
I
in
can't
here.
remember if it's there or not, but this is Tynan who produces a volume of memoirs in 1913, which is for us a very important year here, the year of Yeats's poem. Yeats is very, very keen on this volume of memoirs. It's called 25 Years, Reminiscences, 1913. And I'm just going to read you her memories of how the Fenians were brought down by the Catholic Church. Now, I preface this by saying that Catherine Tynan is a faithful member of the Catholic Church,
Hmm.
but unusual in her literary milieu for being that.
Hmm.
However, she says this. She says Cardinal Cullen and the Irish bishops generally had been stern enemies of Fenianism. It was whispered with horror that Dr. Moriarty, Bishop of Kerry, in other respects a man in advance of his age, had said that hell was not bad enough, nor eternity long enough to punish the Fenians.
Hmm.
In my own home, the Fenians were looked upon as stainless heroes of a lost cause, martyrs for Ireland, and doubtless it was so in thousands of homes, so that there were murmurings. The Fenians, or those privy to their plans and purposes, were practically excommunicated. Ellen O'Leary, John O'Leary's sister, told me long years after how an old Jesuit priest at Gardiner Street received and absolved the Fenians, but many an old Fenian railed upon the church till the day he died, always accepting this or that member of an order who had not felt himself bound by the bishop's commands and should be the means of reconciling with the church at last. That's all, Catherine Tynan. Um, so this vicious anti-clericalism, determined, which is also political. You have wrecked the prospects for Irish nationhood, Catholic establishment. That is the feeling.
It's so as we're going through this, and I was aware of the kind of anti-clericalism among the Fenians and the sort of hostility, but not in reading Tynan's, you really get a sense of it, and I can see immediately the first stanza of September 1913, when
Mm.
that prayer to Shivering Prayer, you sort of get where is this anger coming from, and you can start seeing it right there. So I think that
It
makes
is,
a lot of sense. Yeah.
yeah. I mean, you'll notice that Catherine Tynan also, of course, plays into another narrative, which is that people grew to hate the church, but of course, there was always one good priest who would reconcile them
Hmm.
to the
Yeah.
church at
Yeah.
last.
Yeah.
Now, if we go back to the old O'Leary, oh, he'd ceased to be quite so pagan in his late years. And indeed, he died a Catholic. He was given a proper mass at the end, and he was, well, this is true or not, we will never know. He was said to have been reconciled to the church, so that he lived through the narrative, which is in some ways a required narrative. Um, but that might be another question for us.
Yeah, it's interesting thinking about it's with O'Leary in the grave, and you don't, as you're reading this poem, it's sort of you take it at that more generic,
Mm,
general level, he's dead. You don't think as much about the question of the funeral and how
mm,
people were thinking about this person around the time of a funeral. Because again, with
mm.
it feels in the poem, if you don't know much about the context, it feels in the poem as if O'Leary's some guy from the distant past.
Yep.
Um, like Simon and Garfunkel, where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio, or something?
Yep.
Right? I remember seeing an interview with DiMaggio right after that came out. He's like, "Well, I've never gone anywhere," right? So he's still around. But I mean, O'Leary's in the grave in 1913, but it's not that. It was his funeral was not that long ago, and I know you have some slides that sort of talk a little bit
Yeah.
about the
Yeah.
way people responded at the time to his funeral.
Absolutely. I mean, I the you, few slides that you have there, I don't wish to go through them all. People can go through those later for themselves. But there was an English journalist who has very close, ultimately will have quite close contacts with Yeats. Um, but he wrote a kind of obituary for O'Leary in 1907. O'Leary died, get this, on St. Patrick's Day,
Hmm.
1907. Um, but Nevinson had, of course, encountered O'Leary in his Parisian exile earlier on. And there he, he remembers this. Every evening we used to sit for an hour or two on a cafe upon the Boulevard Saint-Michel. And there I listened while he discoursed on, imagine the fun, right? While he discoursed on Ireland's wrongs, his great eyes glowing with a passionate rage. I think it became more passionate the longer you stayed at the cafe. I well remember him saying, "We Irish." By the way, Nevinson's remembering somebody who kept talking about "we Irish." Now, we know someone else who will say "we Irish" a
We are,
lot.
yes, yes.
We Irish have no concern with English people. We are much more foreign to them than the French are. From that spirit of irreconcilable hostility, he never swerved. When I used to meet him, by the way, notice how this doesn't quite gel with the Yeatsian notion of the
Yes,
kind old man.
yes.
Um, uh, when I used to meet him many years later in Dublin, he was still the same rebel, preaching arms as the
Yeah.
only solution and longing for the old days of the pikes and the boys of Wexford. Now, uh, you know, by the late 19th century, pikes were not much good to you. You don't need to be a military historian to, to work that out. But of course, he's actually longing for a long gone time. He's longing for 1798 in some ways.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And you could read a lot of revolutionary nationalism in 19th century Ireland as the attempt to rerun 1798
Mhm. Yes.
again and again.
I mean, the
Uh,
romantic Ireland here, that vision of put your pikes upon your shoulder by the rising of the moon business.
yeah, yeah, you need pikes.
Yeah.
No revolution without pikes. Um, and yeah, I won't dwell on it, but you'll see that Maud Gonne comes into Nevinson's. Uh,
You also had
no,
one of Joyce writing a
this
bit about O'Leary too.
how interesting that this exists. I mean, I have to say it's only quite recently I tumbled to this one, but Joyce got really quickly into print within 5 days of O'Leary's death.
Hmm.
Writing in a paper in Trieste. So this is the English version of Joyce's Italian. But uh, here we see the, what shall we call it? The sad O'Leary, the
Yeah.
melancholic
Yeah.
O'Leary, returned to his native land after years spent in study. He found himself among a generation animated by ideals quite different
Hmm.
from those of 65,
Hmm.
1865. He was received by his compatriots with marks of honor and from time to time appeared in public to preside over some separatist conference or some banquet. But, and I'm thinking of the Sheen again, but he was a figure from a world which had disappeared.
It's fascinating because as I was looking through this just now, as you started to read it, I just immediately thought, oh yeah, so Sheen, based on what you said before. And yes.
Yeah.
That makes
And,
sense.
this rather sad picture of the old man shuffling
Hmm.
down the bookshops in the quays and picking up something, going home, adding it to the collection. Um, in a way, serving the past.
Hmm.
Uh, he had little reason to be happy. His plots had gone up in smoke. His friends had died, and in his own native land, very few knew who he was and what he had done. Now that he's dead,
This is Joyce.
Simon will escort him to the tomb with great pomp, because the Irish, even though they break the hearts of those who sacrifice their lives for their native land, never fail to show great respect for the dead.
Yeah, classic Joyce there.
It's a wonderful, wonderful. I mean, maybe it is. Well, I just didn't know it, and it strikes me as
I
a
love it. I love it. I had not seen this one before either, and it's just so you just Joyce 1907.
yeah,
This, of course, this is how he would respond to
yeah.
O'Leary's funeral. Yes.
So, I mean, in a way, Rob, we do need, and it's an interesting thing about this poem, is that for something that looks in a way and form so traditional, it's making all sorts of demands on us.
Mm.
We need to look at the funeral.
Hmm.
It's, with O'Leary in the grave, the more you hear that, the more you need to know. Well, tell me about how he got in that grave. You know what happened, and I think we do need, in a funny way, to know about the funeral in order to understand the animus of the poem.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
everybody was at the funeral, as Joyce predicted. One person was not at the funeral. W.B. Yeats, the old protege. And in Poetry and Patriotism, which is published by the Cooler enterprise in 1908. So that's only, just over a year after the funeral itself. You have what is in many ways the classical Yeatsian statement. He's saying something, and I think Roy Foster has pointed this out. He's saying something that's really potent in Irish terms, which is, XYZ, Mr. XYZ, I didn't go to his funeral. This is one of the most pregnant things that you can ever possibly say. Yeats actually was in Dublin the day of uh, of O'Leary's funeral. So he had to go to Dublin. In fact, he had to physically go to Dublin from
Hmm.
England in
Hmm.
order not to go to the funeral. It wouldn't be any good if he'd said, "Well, I've got an appointment in London that night." That doesn't do the trick. You have to say, "Yes, I did go to Dublin, but no, I did not go to the funeral." The evening of the funeral, Yeats spent delivering a high-minded and far-reaching lecture on the poems of Rabindranath Tagore.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, which did not mention anything about Irish nationalism,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
even though, as we know, Tagore is in many ways in a cultural movement in India that mirrors the Irish movement. It has all sorts of connections, but not that night. So
And
the
here, yeah,
the,
here's the Irish Times. You have the
the
report.
that
Yes.
is, I've put that on largely because I'm so fond of the sensitivity with which the advert was placed at the bottom. So you hear about the funeral of Mr. John O'Leary. Um, the luxury of a bath is incomplete without the addition of Scrub's cloudy ammonia, um, which refreshes and invigorates.
You got a bit of the Ulysses there, the plum trees potted meat business in the Hades episode, right? Yeah.
Yeah, this is the Dublin of James Joyce
Yeah.
that we are seeing. But you'll notice, you just the attendance was large, notwithstanding the very inclement weather, and a considerable number of sympathisers having come from different parts of the country to be present at the obsequies. And here it comes. After Mass at St Andrew's Roman Catholic Church, Westland Row, okay, that's sending a message.
Right.
Whither the remains had been removed the previous night, the cortege proceeded to Glasnevin. The grave in which the body was interred is close to that of Charles Gavin Duffy. This is another important figure, cultural, political figure. The coffin was covered with a flag, presented. Now look, very interesting. Through here comes a very unfenian figure indeed.
Yes, John Redmond. Yeah.
Through Mr. John Redmond MP, by the Daughters of Erin 98 Memorial Association. Final prayers were read in Irish. I mean, nobody able to understand the Irish, but by God, they're going to read them in Irish.
Yeah.
But the Daughters of Erin 98 Memorial Association, that is, of course, 1798 Memorial,
Yes.
back to the United Irishmen and their rebellion. Now, if we just go back to that previous slide, Rob, yeah, just to give you, this is Yeats turning the volume up to 11, I think, in 1908. When Mr. O'Leary died, I could not bring myself to go to his funeral, though I had been once his close fellow worker. And I shrank from seeing about his grave so many whose nationalism was different from anything he had taught or that I could share. It's very grand, rhetorically. It seems at the same time slightly mean-spirited.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
These people weren't O'Leary's fault, you could say. Yes, John Redmond, perhaps not to Yeats's taste. Is that a reason for the public staying away? But then, as though that wasn't enough, he brings in another member of the O'Leary circle, John F. Taylor, who loathed Yeats, by the way, who absolutely loathed W.B. Yeats, thought him a complete fraud. He had a lower view of Yeats than T.S. Eliot would have later. Absolute, nothing between his ears was Taylor's view of Yeats. And yet he has been brought in to a little place of honor here. He belonged, as did his friend John F. Taylor, to the romantic, there's the word, to the romantic conception of Irish nationality on which Lionel Johnson and I myself founded. So, so far as it was founded in anything but literature, our art, and our Irish criticism. Wow. He apologizes to the spirit of O'Leary next. But this is odd. You might say, what the heck is Lionel Johnson doing in here? He's not even in Glasnevin. However, this changes slightly when you realize that Yeats's great friend, Lionel Johnson, died on the same day as Yeats's great enemy, John F. Taylor. Mm-hmm. And indeed, if you dig in the Irish press enough, you'll actually find joint obituaries for them because they happen to pass away on the same day. Quite remarkable. Poetry and Patriotism in 1908 appears in a little cooler volume alongside a lengthy and impeccably nationalist essay about Ireland by the Englishman Lionel Johnson. Now, one must, as always with Yeats, one must read a little beyond. Anything autobiographical by Yeats is also fictional or fictive in many ways, and at least here. But we do need to know more, or at least I feel that the poem is asking me to know more about what Yeats objected to in that graveside world. Now, I have sort of not answers to that, but things to suggest, or things to float. First of all,
here's the here's the Catherine Tynan one that you said earlier. So there it is. So in case people are looking for that one, they can see it here.
Just good. Yeah,
that was the Tynans.
Because one of my answers to my own question there is that there is sectarianism to be dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
And that and if I go right back to the beginning, you're saying, why is this interesting? This is partly interesting because Yeats is making a creative power out of a deep sectarianism, which not only he has, but which is, in fact, getting us back to the anti-clericalism of Irish nationalism in the
Yeah.
19th century.
Yeah.
No. So look, can we come back to that first stanza? What need you? Remember this? What need you being come to sense, but fumble in a greasy till and add the halfpence to the pence and prayer to shivering prayer until you've dried the marrow from the bone? For men were born to pray and save. Now, look, when I get to for men were born to pray and save, plainly, this is not W.B. Yeats saying that it is his view that men were born to pray and save. It is Yeats using a caustic ventriloquism to characterize the mean-spiritedness of a bit of contemporary Ireland.
Right. Right.
Now,
Let me get
who
to that first. Let me get back to the poem if I can find it here
is lurking back there somewhere?
somewhere in the back here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
men were born to
Yeah,
pray.
so that's right, and I think that that's one of the confusing things as students are reading it. Whose voice is that saying for men were born to pray and save? And a
Yeah,
lot depends on how as you're reading it aloud, having to stress that he's ventriloquizing this kind of common sort of perspective, and it has that. You're right. It has that sectarianism in there, and this kind of severing off, or this way of creating out of that kind of sectarian view and rejection of it, a different kind of vision of the real romantic Ireland for Yeats, I suppose.
yeah. I mean, there are little. In a way, one has to, and this is not untypical of Yeats. The small details get bigger as you worry over them.
Hmm.
I want to worry over the greasy till a little bit.
Okay.
My question is, why is it greasy? And I have to say, I'm remembering an encounter with some students once when I asked that very question, and somebody quite seriously said, "Is it maybe a fish and chip shop?" But I think it's probably not. I think it's probably not. Um, but
I mean, I've always sort of said, well, that it's about how open, how obviously how frequently it's being opened and closed. So it's greased up, so it's smooth the
nitty
transactions, constantly
smoothing
making money. Yeah.
it, and that would take us to the verb grease to grease somebody's palm as well.
Yes. Yes.
That also is possible. Yeah, I would agree with all that. But we must add other things. That is to say, greasy as an adjective. If we spend time digging a bit historically, turns out to have had a vigorous life um, as meaning anointed or smeared with grease or chrism. A contemptuous term, says the OED, applied to Roman Catholic priests.
Oh, okay. Okay.
No,
I was thinking that's where you were going. I did
yeah,
not know the OED. I felt there was some kind of this hostility to Catholicism embedded in there. My guess would have been more tied to like indulgences or something like that. But
well, yeah,
I did not think of that, the anointing as,
yeah,
yes. Okay.
yeah. Well, no, let us not get too excited because the last use of that would appear to be 1582, a little before Yeats's time.
Okay.
We must not ever forget that Yeats was very well read as a young man and almost at random in 16th century literature. But I think it might have stuck around. But there's another more, if you like, obvious reason that is hidden because of the way in which the text evolved. Okay, Yeats sent. He wrote this poem, by the way, in that impeccably Irish location of Bath in Somersetshire. Uh, uh, and he was very excited about having written it. Um, he only really he wrote it, he thought, because he got away from his correspondence for 2 days. So it's like us shutting down the email. Yeats going away for 2 days. to
Right.
write that. But in order to do that, he writes to he's so excited. He writes to the first audience. In other words, there's an audience before the audience of the Irish Times.
Oh,
Okay, a few weeks before, and that is Augusta Gregory. Um, we have a fair copy of the poem he sent to her, which is largely what we read in the Irish Times. But in his letter to her, he becomes, well, more explicit about the question of the greasy till. And I'll just find my. Here he is. It's very close. It's very close to when he gets poem published. It's the 9th of August. Um, he says, I wrote a poem which I will send you. A poem about modern Ireland in 4 verses.
mhm.
I think the poem good, but wonder if the allusion to tallow in the first verse explains itself. And you look at it, there's no tallow.
Sallow.
Um, um, I mean those holy candles
Oh,
is the result of a passage I'd made up for my speech on the gallery, that is on Hugh Lane's gallery, but had to tone down.
oh, that's interesting.
Passage was, if the intellectual movement is defeated,
Right.
Ireland will become for our time a little huckstering nation, groping in a greasy till for halfpence by the light of a holy candle.
Huh.
Um, so, uh, as Yeats says, he had to tone it down because he'd already, as so often, he'd already made arrangements for the press to cover his speech that night. So this was already going to be public. Um, it was a benefit performance for the great Hugh Lane Gallery project in London at the Court Theatre. Performance by the Abbey Players of George Bernard Shaw's The Showing Up of Blanco Posnet. And the Manchester Guardian was there. And you can read the Manchester Guardian, 15th of July, 1913. Yeats told the audience, if Hugh Lane is defeated, hundreds of young men and women all over the country will be discouraged. Ireland will for many years become a little huckstering nation, groping for halfpence in a greasy till. Um, so the light of a holy candle is gone. There is a lot, in other words, there is a lost first draft
Hmm.
of this poem,
Hmm.
which
Hmm.
had the word tallow in it.
Yes.
I think it is the tallow dripping from the holy candle that is making the till greasy.
That's so fascinating. And that's perfect, of course, in a way, because the mixture here of mercantilism and Catholicism is one that, you can see in the adding of prayer to shivering prayer, this kind of, calculation and quantification, etc., is the link. But the tallow dripping on the till is makes it really explicit
Yeah.
that these two are intertwined. The Catholicism and mercantilism are somehow intertwined in this kind of corruption, which, and you can understand why Yeats didn't want to go quite so far in that kind of, in that direction. It goes, I mean, the poem goes kind of far, but
It
that
does.
definitely emphasizes the
Yeah.
that kind of anti-clericism.
I mean, you're right. I mean, it's rather strange to say, well, I'm going to burn most of the bridge, but maybe not all of
Yeah.
it. I don't know. But as it goes on, of course, what's going to happen is that the figure in that first stanza, who is going to actually turn up again within a few weeks as Paudine
Yes. Yeah.
in the poem of that title, and who had turned up as Paudine, in fact, in the To a Wealthy Man poem in January. Um, uh, does it? I don't want to go down the Paudine route, but I'll just add to the confusion by saying that Catherine Tynan had a dog called Paudine, who was
Oh,
a great friend of Lionel Johnson. So
okay.
let us not dwell on that. Um, but the the Pauline figure here is to be rebuked.
Yes.
I think rebuke is, of course, again, it's a poetic mode. We know that, but uh, we perhaps more than in Yeats's time are very attuned as readers to rebuke, and our question is, well, who are you to rebuke this?
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
What is your basis? Um, and what this character is going to be rebuked with is the past. It's specifically, I think, 1798. Uh, and the names will be named, just as in Easter 1916, names are going to be rather important. So they turn out to be here. Um,
And
but
that sudden shift in the second stanza, yet they were of a different kind, is jarring because initially, as you're reading it, if you're unfamiliar with the poem, encountering it for the first time, and imagining people reading this in a newspaper for the first time, you think, okay, we're still in the present. And all of a sudden, we're starting to realize, whoa, he's rebuking these people in the present, this
yeah,
corruption in the present, with something that's actually part of the distant past and tied into heroic martyrdom.
it's ironic, isn't it? In this poem is multi-layered in its ironies, but one of them is that the voice of this poem is going to drag people from the grave
Yeah,
in
yeah,
order to make its point. You
yeah,
know,
yeah,
there's
yeah.
only one person in the grave. It's going to be O'Leary, but I'm afraid that Fitzgerald and Emmett and Tone are kind of dragged out of the grave
Hmm. Yes.
by the voice. Um, what do they have in common? Eh, There's one thing they have in common. They're all Protestants.
Mm, mm.
Okay.
I was thinking the line, but little time had they to pray,
Yeah,
of course, but you're right. Of course, it's not just that they were not praying. It's not praying the Catholic prayer is not adding prayer to shivering prayer. They're all
exactly.
Protestant. Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, it may be that the voice, whether we call that W.B. Yeats or not, but the voice of this poem, let's just say it's not a Catholic voice.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and the we go back to what had bedeviled the 1798 centenary celebrations in Dublin in 1898 and in London, which is how you deal with the sheer weight of Protestantism, or the weight of almost Presbyterianism, indeed, from the United Irishmen, who, and of course, I'm simplifying wildly, but who were fundamentally of an Enlightenment cast of mind, who took inspiration from certainly from the American Revolution, uh, who were very closely associated with Tom Paine, for example, and
Hmm.
Tone and Robert Emmet in that light, but also closely associated with events in France at the end of the 18th century.
Hmm. Hmm.
Both Emmet and Tone uh, are involved in what we would call diplomatic um, campaigns to get France to fight against uh, Britain, uh, ideally in Ireland, you know, and that's a whole world of historical complexity. But Yeats is aware of it.
Yeah.
Um, it it's a kind of, the Enlightenment Revolution. 1798 is the great failed Enlightenment revolution in which Irish nationalism would have been secular.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, Now, it doesn't take long in the 19th century for that to change and change radically. And, we talk about Daniel O'Connell and Catholic emancipation, but O'Connell, who you'll remember later on, Yeats calls the great comedian.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not much respect there, I think. Um, was it for no before then? Of course, we have a slightly incompatible set of Irish exiles, the wild geese. These are the people who, after the Williamite defeat, after being defeated by William and eventually become Jacobites, who
Yeah.
are actually raising European regiments. Was it for this the wild geese spread the grey wing on every tide? For this that all that blood was shed. For this Edward Fitzgerald died, and Robert Emmet and Wolfe Tone. All that delirium of the brave. Delirium is a fantastically. I love the line, by the way. All that delirium
It
of the
is,
brave.
it's my favorite line in the poem, and it is fascinating. It's interesting to think about this idea of a kind of secular nationalism, that you're the possibility of a secular nationalism. And as you're talking, I can see more clearly than I've not seen this as clearly before. I've sort of thought about it, but it makes a lot of sense now. The kind of romantic Ireland he's defining is so different from that kind of Catholic nationalism of the 1800s, and going back to some other imaginary, secular nationalist vision. But that secular nationalist vision still has to have its kind of spiritual dimension and meaning, some kind of imperative or injunction that people are following and inspiring towards. And I think here we've got delirium, and it's such an interesting word, because it seems like, well, they were deluded, etc. But there's an idea of a kind of heroic fidelity that is akin actually to faith. It's
Yeah.
just it's now on the secular side.
You see, I think it takes us back to O'Leary.
Yeah.
I think that Yeats sees that delirium in the more violent than he lets on.
It's interesting. Yeah.
It's going to bear remote consequences in Yeats's work. I think it's going to feed into what he later or on calls the was it hysterical passio.
Uh-huh.
Uh,
Uh-huh.
imagines King Lear, but when he thinks about King Lear, he thinks, yes, about his own grandfather, but he also thinks about John O'Leary.
Huh.
And so these, in Yeats's imagination, these figures touch one another in
Mm,
some ways. Now,
mm.
in terms of political realities, by the way, in 1913, this is crazy.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
makes this makes the least sense. This is calculated to do even more damage to the Hugh Lane Picture Gallery appeal than the previous poem had done, and that was considerable.
Yeah.
It's the next day the Dublin Corporation meets and votes negatively. In fact, from Lane's point of view, Lane takes us. He says, "I'm going to take my pictures to London," and then a great saga will unfold, which we need to
Yeah.
contain ourselves with here.
Yeah, it is really interesting to think of this. The what a horrible strategy if your aim was, in fact, to get this gallery built, to
Yes.
write this poem in this way. But yeah,
Yeah.
Yates can't help himself. I mean, he loves this mode.
This, this is uh, this is this is in fact a glimpse in advance of the Yeats who will take the sword presented to him, the samurai sword presented to him.
Potato sword, yeah.
That's right, and terrify a visiting journalist by wandering up and down the room, waving the sword and shouting, "Conflict, more conflict!"
Mm, mm, mm.
Already, but this was noticed, right? I'm proposing that we have to understand part of this as a sectarian poem.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, there is the pain here, which Yeats we know did experience, of Irish nationalism having been taken over by the last people who should have taken it over, in his
Hmm.
view, which were middle class uh, and seriously committed Roman Catholics.
Hmm.
Uh, from Yeats's background, he couldn't be anything other than appalled by that.
Hmm.
And I just take us back to poor old O'Leary, though, still in the grave, but uh, and why Yeats is not at that funeral. There's somebody else there. And
Yeah.
it's not that it's John Redmond, okay, the famous politician was there, but how much can it hurt to be in a crowd of 1,000 watching him? Not much. The other person takes us to the late stage O'Leary. What we have on the left is John O'Leary.
It's John O'Leary, right? Is that
This is taken in I think 1902. Um,
oh,
and
is that John McBride?
it
Um,
certainly is,
yeah.
it certainly is John McBride.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
And I'll tell you about where they are in a moment, but the fact that they're together at all is enough to send Yeats's pressure off the scale. What had been going on? Well, McBride attached himself to O'Leary, and O'Leary was powerfully attracted also to the image of Major McBride. What had McBride done after all? McBride had done that curiously old-fashioned thing of teaming up, I mean, old-fashioned, but never quite out of fashion, of teaming up with the British Empire's enemies in the name of Ireland.
Hmm.
So McBride was a devoted Boer fancier and had, of course, done stuff in the Boer War. He Yeats was neutral on the question of the Boer War. He didn't say very much. He certainly didn't take that England's enemy must be my friend line. It was difficult for him because Maud Gonne, as you may know, was in the habit of making plans to blow up troop ships and things like that
Yeah,
during the war.
yeah, yeah.
The Boer cause was, when people celebrate their political bets of the past, you don't get that many people saying, and we always supported the Boers when they fought against Britain. That one didn't turn out so very well, did it? But the McBride had also married, and he had married Maud Gonne. What did Maud Gonne do in order to marry McBride? If you'd asked Yeats that question, the first thing he would have said is the one unforgivable thing. She turned Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what's a nice girl like you, etc., etc. What on earth, as Yeats thought, was Maud Gonne doing in turning to this socially retrograde religion? But it hadn't been happy. And Yeats is on the inside track of what was going on.
Yeah.
And people will continue to argue about this. But I'm just trying to summarize what I think is accepted more or less generally, which is that McBride's alcoholism led him to violence. And that violence was directed at Maud, and at least Yeats believed it was directed at the young girl.
It is. Yeah.
Result. Sexual assault was certainly claimed. Yeats accepted this story and was on Maud's side. What about Irish politics? Because this broken marriage became a political story, and it became a political story very fast. There were no tabloids quite, but it was a kind of tabloid thing. And the great hero, the man who'd fought the British Empire, McBride, couldn't be a bad man. He couldn't.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he was defended. Maud couldn't even go near Ireland for several years. He teamed up with O'Leary. O'Leary took his part. This is always kept hidden a bit. O'Leary
I
was very
did
much.
not know this at all.
You know,
This is really interesting. Yeah.
here's the team. Here they are. Across the generations, here is physical force nationalism.
Yeah.
My God, McBride knew a bit about physical force and tells us a bit about physical force. But the two of them, I mean, the other thing, I feel that I'm sliding into the tabloidese myself, and I apologize. The other thing about these years in O'Leary's life is it was well known that he was himself very, very fond of drink. So, there was a kind of drunken fidelity to the lost past.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We know that, by the way, that McBride is executed after 1916, but the story is that he just happened to be walking or staggering past Jacob's biscuit factory on the day and saw something was going on, so in he went. This is all quite strange, right? No, where the question I said I'd ask, where are they? They're in a railway carriage, I think, or a building by a railway. They're actually in Belgium.
Oh, really? Wow. Oh.
Now, what are they doing in Belgium? They're on a jolly, but it's a sort of IRB related jolly, and they're going to a little village, or they've just been in a little village called Fontenoy. Uh, James Joyce, by the way, lived on the Fontenoy Street. But Fontenoy, which I'm probably mispronouncing, was the site of one of those blessed moments in Irish nationalist imagination, or history as they call it, which is that this is where a regiment of the wild geese in
Yeah.
1745
Yeah.
took on and defeated
Yeah.
an
Yeah.
English force. It's the one defeat in the field for the British forces that can be laid to 19th century, to 18th century nationalist uh, cause. Um, this was a major event that they'd been to. There was a lot of press coverage, and the hope there in that picture is that even now, filthy modern tide all around them, they can see a way
Hmm.
of getting in the field again.
Hmm.
As far as we can understand O'Leary's thinking, he was pretty consistent in thinking that the way for Irish nationalism to triumph was in military contest with Britain, which meant armies meeting armies.
It's so fascinating. I mean, this is such a different kind of vision of O'Leary than,
Yeah,
Yeats is offering us
yeah,
in his autobiographies, as I was saying before. And that picture is stunning because it explains so much of the anger in the poem, you know,
yeah,
and, and his attempts, Yeats's attempts to manage a different sort of vision of nationalism, countering this what we're getting here in this image or this direct lineage.
yeah.
Uh,
And
yeah.
of course, we need to remember that for most people who were well informed and watching at close quarters in Irish politics in the early 20th century, the idea that there would be some kind of great military encounter between people wearing rather dashing uniforms, just preposterous.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
it is a thing of the imagination rather than reality. Um, Now, just to let you know, we're back to the funeral, and we find the Wolfe Tone and United Irishmen Memorial Committee represented.
Hmm.
Guess the chairman of that? It's Major John McBride.
Okay.
He's right at the head of things. No wonder Yeats didn't want to be
Oh
there.
gosh. Okay. Okay. That
So
makes sense.
McBride presents a wreath. It's a terrible pity there was no television. What a televisual moment this would have been.
Right.
He steps forward with a wreath, and on it is this inscription from the Wolfe Tone Memorial. Had Erin's sons been all as true, we had not lost her.
Oh gosh. Wow.
Kind of rebuke.
Yes.
You've all let O'Leary down.
Yeah.
He's been betrayed by, well, pretty much the second half of the 19th century.
Yeah.
All of them. And he's actually misquoting a poem by a Fenian poet. That is a poet associated with the 1860s Fenian movement. I said earlier that these things, literature and politics, were close. A man called John Keegan Casey, whom you don't hear much about from Yeats, but I think the number of echoes of Casey that I found in the very early work show that he obviously read him. The Hills of Connemara, 1867. If Ireland's sons were all as true, we never would have lost her.
Hmm.
So a bit of Fenian poetry goes to the grave with O'Leary too. presented by these unworthy hands. You can see that Yeats was, you know, upset by this. And it actually does take him years to get over it. But in writing September 1913, he's writing a poem that formally resembles Ellen O'Leary's poetry. And I put one poem that he puts in his 1890s anthology of Irish verse by Ellen O'Leary has a very similar kind of refrain plus 6-line structure. But it feels also, it has a very interesting echo of Thomas Davis. Thomas Davis, the poet that Yeats could never say he liked. He could never fake it enough to persuade
Yeah.
anyone. But you know, those lines I was reading you from this poem about Fitzgerald, etc. Here's Davis, green above the red. Sure 'twas for this Lord Edward died, and wolf tone sank serene, because they could not bear to leave the red above the green. And 'twas for this that Owen fought on Sarsfield nobly bled, because their eyes were hot to see the green above the red. It's excellent. It's terrible. But this is, I mean, he also, by the way, is the author of a very bad historical poem about the Battle of Fontenoy that they all knew extremely well. So Yeats is inhabiting, and back to what Terry Brown was saying, he's inhabiting this form, which is Young Ireland verse, which is Fenian verse, and he's turning it inside out. He's turning it into the verse of an angry, middle-aged man who has seen a bit too much.
And such a different vision of nationhood and nationalism and lineage than everything that upset him about O'Leary's funeral and the link between Catholicism and nationalism from the 1800s. It's a kind of rewriting then of history.
But I'll just say there's more where that came from. But I feel I've possibly said enough and to spare.
I think this was I love it. This was such a rich discussion of that poem. I've learned a ton. It was such a pleasure having a chance to talk with you about it, Peter. And I look forward to seeing you again in person at some point. Um,
I'm sure I shall.
I'm sure we will. Well, thanks for doing this.
Perhaps we'll meet at a funeral, a political funeral somewhere.
I have to check the guest list before I decide if I'm going or not. So we'll see.
No.
All right, it was
But
great. It was great talking to you. Thanks so much.
thank you very much.